There's a question that everyone who's read the books or played the games in the Metro universe sooner or later asks themselves, where did it all begin? Not when Artyom emerged from the tunnel with a flashlight and a knife, but earlier, much earlier. Since the day the world decided to destroy itself and succeeded. There's no official version. Survivors of the Moscow Metro tell different stories about how exactly World War III began. Most of them are fragments, conjectures, rumors, passed from mouth to mouth in the dim light of underground stations. But one version has stuck more than the others, and it goes something like this. It all started with Iran and its nuclear program. In our world, the one that still exists, the international community managed, with great difficulty and through years of negotiations, to sign an agreement that brought Iran's nuclear activities under control in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. Tensions eased and the conflict froze. But in the Metro universe, this story ended differently. There, no agreement was reached. Israel, unwilling to wait for its neighbor to acquire an atomic bomb, launched a preemptive strike first. This decision set off a chain reaction that no one could stop. Russia, China, and North Korea sided with Iran. The United States and NATO countries sided with Israel. The world was split into two camps, and a war began that would later be called World War III. At first, countries tried their best not to cross the line, to avoid using nuclear weapons. Everyone understood all too well what this would mean, so other means were used. Chemical weapons, biological weapons, and so-called dirty bombs. Radiological weapons that don't reduce cities to rubble, but contaminate the area so much that it becomes uninhabitable. The idea was to weaken the enemy while preserving their infrastructure. Factories, roads, buildings. Kill people, but preserve what they built. Several Russian cities came under such attacks. Khabarovsk and Novosibirsk housed military facilities, and the enemy wanted access to their research and development. Then the Kremlin was attacked too, with a biological bomb dropped there. The historical monuments survived, the walls remained standing, but Red Square and the Kremlin grounds were seriously contaminated. It was already very close, too close. Russia began preparing for the worst. Government circles understood perfectly well that a nuclear conflict was becoming inevitable, and they needed to somehow secure an advantage. The decision was then made to conduct a series of experiments to develop a new generation of soldiers, people who would be stronger, more resilient, and able to withstand radiation exposure where an ordinary person would die within hours. These experiments were conducted in utter secrecy, in a network of government underground bunkers being built in close proximity to the Moscow Metro. That's why this classified infrastructure was dubbed Metro 2, as opposed to the regular Metro, which everyone knew about. This underground network included Bunker D6, a massive, well-equipped facility that the Russian authorities were preparing as a government shelter in the event of a nuclear war. All the necessary communications, supplies, and life support systems were there. Work was also underway on a project codenamed Dark. Scientists had succeeded in achieving something previously only seen in science fiction, developing an entirely new species of life. Creatures with black, seemingly burnt skin. That's why they would later be called blacks. They were faster than humans, more resistant to radiation, and possessed telepathic abilities. They were essentially the next stage of evolution, only forced, created in a laboratory by government order. But here's the paradox. It was precisely their telepathic abilities that led to some of them being released. Several individuals somehow managed to convince the scientists, possibly through direct influence on their consciousness, to release them. The rest remained in D6, hibernating in one of the bunker's compartments. Those who emerged took one of the Metro 2 lines to the botanical garden and established their nest there, a place that would later be called the Hive. While these secret experiments were taking place underground, the war above ground was escalating. China decided to deal with Japan without engaging in direct conflict, in a manner so brutal it's hard to comprehend. The Chinese army detonated a thermonuclear bomb in the Pacific Ocean. The underwater explosion, so powerful, generated a colossal tsunami that literally submerged the entire Japanese archipelago. The Russian Far East also suffered, with Vladivostok completely submerged. And yet, despite all this horror, despite biological bombs and sinking cities, there was still no nuclear apocalypse. The countries were kept on the brink. Until July 6, 2013, that brink was crossed. That day, the countries exchanged nuclear strikes. Not just one strike, not two. A massive exchange. The planet was ablaze. Billions perished. In Russia alone, 140 million people died. That's almost the entire country's population. Almost, but not all. Some survived. Primarily those who managed to find shelter in nuclear bunkers and fallout shelters. And the largest such shelter in Russia was the Moscow metro. Even after World War II, when it became clear that nuclear weapons were a thing of the past, the Moscow metro began to be refitted. Radiation filters were installed, and hermetic seals were constructed that could withstand the shockwave and keep radiation out. It was a vast, extensive, deep shelter right beneath the city, and on the day of the attack, thousands of people rushed into it. Among those who escaped and were saved was a 4-year-old boy named Artyom, along with his mother. At that moment, they were walking near the botanical garden and had just reached Timiryazeevskaya station. Who could have known then that this child would one day become one of the key figures in the history of the Moscow metro? No one, of course. That day, everyone was simply running, thinking only about how to survive. Survivors also existed in other cities, in places with metro systems, St. Petersburg, Novosibirsk. People also survived in the southern regions, in central Russia, in the taiga, in the Far East, in places where there were no direct nuclear strikes. The country's official authorities also survived. They hid in a bunker near Taganskaya station and retreated into the shadows, observing what was happening. Meanwhile, things began to happen above ground that made returning there increasingly impossible. The massive amount of radiation altered the entire planet's climate. Earth was plunged into a nuclear winter. Moscow was frozen solid. Hotter regions, on the other hand, experienced sharp temperature fluctuations, floods, and droughts. But the most terrifying changes were happening to wildlife. Animals and plants began to mutate. New species appeared on the surface, species not found in any zoology textbook. Ghouls, rhinoceroses, spider beetles, winged demons. Some of them found their way into the metro, through ventilation shafts, through unsealed seals, through breaches in the tunnels, and populated abandoned stations and passages. Down below, underground, people were trying to build a new life. They were running electric generators. They were growing mushrooms and vegetables under artificial lighting. They were breeding animals. They were inventing a new economy, and they did. 5.45 caliber bullets, popularly nicknamed fives, became currency, not because they were particularly convenient as coins, but because they had real value. They could be fired and therefore used for defense and hunting. Money that would never lose its value, provided the dangers around never ended. Gradually, self-government began to form at the stations. Residents elected station masters, established rules, and negotiated with neighbors. Trade arose between stations, and alliances formed. The official authorities, the same ones that had taken refuge in the bunker near Taganskaya, remained, but preferred to remain in the shadows. They created the Moscow Defense Command and began to manage the metro quietly, discreetly. Rumors of a surviving government spread through the stations, accumulating details and becoming legends. People spoke of invisible observers, secret guardians of power who monitored everyone but remained invisible themselves. In reality, these invisible observers were preoccupied with something entirely different. They believed the war wasn't over, that enemies still existed, that Moscow needed to be protected, that information was a weapon that couldn't be left in the wrong hands. So the first thing they did was try to convince the rest of the world that Moscow was gone, that the city was lost. The operation was dubbed SHIELD. To achieve this, they established ground outposts at the sites of radio centers around the city and installed powerful jammers on them, preventing any signals from entering or leaving. Metro residents found themselves in an information blockade. Unable to pick up a single signal from outside, they began to believe there was simply no one left. that they were the last. The military patrolled the city's borders and killed anyone who tried to infiltrate Moscow as spies. An iron curtain, only no longer political, but literal. A year had passed since the war. Little Artyom lived at Timiryazevskaya station with his mother, and at some point the station was overrun by rats. Huge, hungry, and vicious. His mother died. The boy was saved by a lookout named Alexander Sukhoi, one of those people who would later be called real rats. He took Artyom with him, reached the VDNKH station, became its director, and raised the boy as his own son. VDNKH, the exhibition of achievements of the national economy, once the pride of the Soviet era, was now just another station, one of many, but for Artyom, it had become home. Meanwhile, something terrifying was happening in Bunker D6. After the Kremlin had been sprayed with a biological weapon, the bacteria living in the underground utilities began to mutate under the influence of the contamination. They interacted with the surrounding flora, and at some point, biomass began to form in the tunnels, a living, aggressive, and constantly growing substance. It reached the bunker's nuclear reactor and began devouring the personnel. Some managed to evacuate to a neighboring station. The rest were not so lucky. In 2018, when Artyom was about 9 years old, mutants attacked Polyanka station. The defenders held out as long as they could, managing to evacuate women and children. But then someone, it's still unclear who or why, opened the hermetic seals. Mutants poured in. Only one person survived, a Serdar named Khan, though no one called him that back then. Polyanka was abandoned, and strange things began to happen there. People passing by reported hallucinations and terrifying visions, most likely the result of an unknown gas leak. Meanwhile, Serdar reached the Akademicheskaya station and, completely unexpectedly, met his wife Yana, from whom the war had separated him at the very beginning. Meanwhile, Artyom grew up and one day realized he couldn't remember his mother's face. He couldn't remember it at all, no matter how hard he tried. The feeling was unbearable, and the boy decided to return to where he'd last seen her, the botanical garden. Maybe something would surface there. Maybe he'd remember. He was 10 years old when he persuaded two of his friends, Zhenya and Vitalik, to sneak into the abandoned botanical garden. They opened the sealed gate and reached the surface. There, Artyom was attacked by a pack of mutated dogs. He would have died if not for the Black One. One of the hive's inhabitants happened to be nearby and saved the boy. By that time, the Black Ones had long been observing the people below and trying to figure out how to establish contact with them. They considered themselves, and not without reason, the next stage of human evolution. They wanted to help people return to the surface. They wanted to establish communication. But telepathy doesn't work like speech. When the Black One attempted to establish a psychic connection with little Artyom, he altered his consciousness. The hermetic seal behind him. He leaves the door open. He himself doesn't fully understand why, but the way is now clear for the mutants. Meanwhile, political life was in full swing in the metro. Stations united, feuded, and formed alliances. Immediately after the war, a group of radical nationalists seized Pushkinskaya station and carried out ethnic cleansing there. News of a station where people could live among their own quickly spread throughout the metro, and nationalists flocked there from all directions. When they had accumulated sufficient strength, they seized the neighboring Tverskaya and Chekhovskaya stations and created an organization with a name that brooked no ambiguity: the Fourth Reich. Almost simultaneously, communists began to gain strength on the Sokolnicheskaya line. They seized most of the stations on the Red Line, from Cherkizovskaya to Sportivnaya, and created a state called the Union of Soviet Socialist Stations, or SSSS for short, or simply the Red Line. Ideological opponents finding themselves in close proximity meant war was guaranteed. The Blue Line, the Arbatsko-Pokrovskaya line, had its own history. Representatives of the Caucasian peoples formed the Arbat Confederation, uniting the stations from Park Pobedi to Ploshchad Revolyutsy, and the Circle Line eventually became something quite special. In the 1920s, the stations on the Ring Road united into an economic union called the Hanseatic League, a reference to the medieval trade union of German cities. The Hanseatic League collected tolls on travel through the Ring Road, controlled trade routes, and quickly became the wealthiest union in the entire metro system. However, it was not possible to completely close the Ring Road. Komsomolskaya station stubbornly remained under communist control. In the 1920s, the first civil war broke out between the factions. It ended, as most underground wars do, in attrition. A peace treaty was signed, and from it, a new structure emerged. Polis, the center of the entire Moscow metro. Former military personnel, the remnants of the Russian armed forces, found refuge in Polis, creating the Sparta Order. The Order's goal is to protect the metro from external threats. They made a point of not interfering in internal affairs. The Sparta Rangers weren't a police force or an army in the traditional sense. They were something between a special forces unit and a monastic order. Rigorous selection, strict discipline, and total dedication to the cause. And yet, these invisible observers had no intention of relinquishing power. They quietly and methodically controlled all the major factions: the Red Line, the Fourth Reich, Polis, Sparta. Everything that happened in the metro, one way or another, passed through their hands. People didn't know this. They thought they were in control of their own lives. By the 1930s, the head of the Red Line Security Committee, a man named Czislaw Korbut, decided it was time to seize power. Not openly. He was too clever for straightforward action. He took a more cunning approach. He convinced Maxim Moskvin that his brother, General Secretary Andrei Moskvin, was planning to get rid of him, that he feared his rival and was plotting his elimination. Maxim believed him and killed his brother. He became the new General Secretary and found himself a puppet in the hands of Korbut, who under a weak leader gained real power. Now he could plan seriously. And by 2033, the Blacks began infiltrating the metro through that same unsealed hermetic seal at the Botanical Garden. They were still trying to establish contact with people, still naively believing they could explain that they had come to help. But it didn't work. The Blacks' telepathic abilities caused hallucinations and panic in people. Those who encountered them were overcome with madness. The survivors couldn't quite explain what had happened, only screaming that they'd seen something terrifying. Rumors of a new threat quickly spread throughout the metro. They even reached one man, a Sparta stalker nicknamed Hunter. He was a friend of Sukhoi, which meant he knew Artyom. When Hunter arrived at VDNKH, he went into the hospital and saw the sentries there who had gone mad after an encounter with the Blacks. For a professional ranger, this was reason enough to investigate personally. Before leaving, he called Artyom over and handed him his order badge. He said, "If I don't return tomorrow, go to Polis to see Colonel Melnik and tell him everything. Everything you know. About the mutants, about the attacks, about everything." Hunter hasn't returned. Artyom waited a day, then two. On the third, he realized there was nothing more to wait for, so he signed up to escort a trade caravan to Rizhskaya station, along with his friend Zhenya. It was the only way to get anywhere. But the usual route turned out to be blocked, and the convoy was forced to take a detour through a service tunnel. There, an anomaly befell them. What exactly it was is unclear, but the effect was psychological. The entire crew lost consciousness. Everyone, that is, except Artyom. He came to quickly. Apparently, the change in consciousness that had occurred to him 10 years ago at the Botanical Garden had given him some stability. While the others lay unconscious, the Draizin was attacked by ghouls. Artyom fired back. He made it to Rizhskaya. They noticed. Rumors spread quickly in the metro, faster than any news on the surface. Soon, everyone at Rizhskaya knew about the guy from VDNKA who couldn't be reached by anomalies. A man nicknamed Bourbon approached Artyom, a seasoned, cautious man. The kind who knows how to negotiate and knows where the right paths lie. Bourbon knew a way to escape the station, bypassing the closed checkpoints, through a tunnel considered cursed. Most people would never venture there. But with a companion immune to anomalies, that was a different matter. Artyom agreed. Not because he particularly wanted to, there was simply no other option. They made their way through the service tunnels and reached Prospect Mira, where Bourbon had to pay a bribe to let them into the station. After that, he no longer had enough money for a ticket to Sukharevskaya, and they had to walk there on the surface, through the snowy streets of nuclear Moscow, past frozen ruins and frozen cars. Cold, quiet, scary, but we got there. Bourbon was captured at Sukharevskaya. It turned out he had an old score to settle with the local gangsters. The kind of thing you never forget or forgive in the metro. A fight ensued. Ultimately, Bourbon and the gang leader killed each other, leaving Artyom alone in the middle of an unfamiliar station. He was rescued from this predicament by a man who seemed to appear out of thin air, Khan. That same survivor from Polyanka, a Serdar with a quiet voice and strange manners. Khan was not quite an ordinary person. He saw the metro differently than others, and he could find paths where others saw only walls. Together, they reached Turgenevskaya, where a small group of sentries was struggling to hold off the mutant onslaught. Artyom helped blow up the necessary tunnels and cut off the threat from the station. Then Khan took him on a detour to Kuznetsky Most and told him his name, Andrei Kuznets. "Find him," Khan said. "He'll help." At Kuznetsky Most, everything went wrong right away. Communist agents mistook Artyom for an accomplice of smugglers, either intentionally or through inattention. It turned out that the only route to Polis ran across the front line between the Red Line and the Fourth Reich. A low-intensity, but very real war was raging there, with positions, checkpoints, and firefights. Artyom climbed into the luggage compartment of a handcar carrying soldiers, rode to the right place, jumped off, and avoided the fighting. But he was eventually captured by the Nazis. Two Sparta Rangers, Ullman and Pavel, rescued him. Seeing Hunter's badge, they agreed to help. After they dealt with the Nazis who were present, they agreed to meet at the Chernoye service station. Artyom and Pavel traveled there on an armored handcar, requisitioned directly from the Reich. On the way to the depot, they were attacked by mutant Nasachi, and one of them killed Pavel. A good man, a bad death. Artyom made his way alone to Paveletskaya, which was in the midst of a mutant invasion. There were no proper hermetic seals, and the creatures were constantly invading. Artyom helped repel the attack, then, at the squad leader's request, reached the radio transmitter and played a recording calling for help. Then he headed to Chernoy, where Ullman was waiting. From there, he took a handcar, finally to Polis. The conversation with Colonel Melnik was short and harsh. Melnik listened to Artyom talk about the Blacks, the threat to VDNKH, and Hunter. He convened a Polis council and asked for military assistance. The council refused. They didn't believe him. He didn't want to believe it. Or rather, it's always easier that way. Melnik decided to act on his own. He knew where to look for answers, and he knew he needed Artyom for that. The answers lay in the library, literally in the Lenin Library, which towered directly above police. There, in the military archives, among tons of dusty papers, were secret documents detailing the location of Bunker D6 and the tunnels leading to it. Artyom needed to get in there and find the necessary papers. It sounds simple, until you realize the library is teeming with librarians. No, they're not kind ladies with index drawers. Librarians are mutants who've taken a liking to the building and become its rightful masters. They're intelligent, fast, and completely unpredictable creatures. Meetings with them rarely end well. Artyom climbed in, found the documents, and retrieved them. He returned alive. This already indicated that the guy from VDNKH was more than just a random fellow traveler in the caravan. With coordinates D6 in hand, the Sparta Rangers moved toward the bunker. They found the entrance through tunnels leading from the Kievskaya station. Inside, they discovered what they had only previously suspected: a huge, well-equipped bunker, which, however, had already been infested with mutants, amoebas, the result of a biological weapon once used against the Kremlin. After dealing with them, the Rangers found a command center with a missile launch system. Melnik made a decision: destroy the Blacks with a strike on the hive. But first, the reactor had to be restarted. The bunker's electrical grid failed, the power went out, and Artyom climbed to the nuclear reactor manually. There, the biomass was waiting for him, the same one that had once destroyed the D6 personnel. It wrapped around the reactor rods. Artyom used the crane equipment to lift the rods and start the reactor. The light returned. Next, they needed to install the laser guidance system. To do this, Melnik and Artyom boarded the monorail and traveled along a secret line to the Ostankino Tower. Artyom climbed to the very top. Along the way, his radio transmitter briefly picked up a strange signal. Strange, unfamiliar, breaking through all the jammers. Something was there. Something outside, but not now. Up above, while setting up the targeting system, Artyom began hallucinating. The blacks were trying to reach him through telepathy, showing him images, trying to explain that they weren't enemies, that they wanted to help. That they weren't monsters, just different. But Artyom didn't understand, or didn't want to understand. The guidance system was installed. The missiles launched. The hive burned. All the blacks died, almost all of them. One hatchling survived. After the hive was destroyed, Sparta's Rangers took over D6 as a new base. They took inventory. They found no food or medicine, but instead discovered military equipment, weapons, and, most terrifying of all, biological weapons, dangerous viral strains sealed in containers. A legacy of the past that would have been better never discovered. A year passed. The nuclear winter began to recede. The surface grew warmer. And this warming made things worse in the metro. Some tunnels began to flood. Particularly affected were the Tretyakovskaya and Novokuznetskaya stations, which were connected by flooded tunnels and transformed into something truly exotic. They were nicknamed Venice. Meanwhile, rumors about D6 were spreading throughout the metro. A legendary bunker, full of military equipment and secrets. It was worth fighting for. The Fourth Reich began sending scouts to search for an entrance. The Red Line took a different, more subtle approach. They infiltrated Sparta's ranks with a spy named Lesnitsky. He infiltrated the group, gained their trust, and at some point leaked the location of D6 to the communists. He also stole a virus sample from the bunker, one of the most dangerous strains discovered during the inventory. Meanwhile, Melnik sent Artyom and his daughter Anna, a sniper respected in Sparta for her precision and calm, to finish off the last surviving black. Khan tried to dissuade Melnik. Khan understood that eliminating the blacks was a mistake, possibly a catastrophic one. But Melnik wouldn't listen. He was used to acting, not reflecting. Artyom found the cub and didn't kill it, not because he was scared. Something just stopped him at the last moment. But before he could fully make up his mind, they were captured by Reich soldiers, who were just then combing the surrounding area for an entrance to D6. The cub was sold to Hansa, who assigned him to a local freak show to exhibit the strange mutant for money. Artyom was taken to Tverskaya station for interrogation. Another person was also captured, a Red Line scout who introduced himself as Pavel Morozov. When the fascists were about to kill Artyom, this Pavel unexpectedly pulled him out. Together they escaped on a motorized trolley. Along the way, they ran into a checkpoint, where the fascists seized Pavel again and were about to hang him. Artyom returned and pulled him out again. Afterwards, they headed together to Teatralnaya, under communist control. There, Pavel offered him a drink to celebrate the miraculous rescue, to celebrate their acquaintance, just because. Artyom drank and then passed out. The glass contained a sleeping pill. Of course, Pavel Morozov wasn't a scout. He was a major in the Red Line, and all this time he was simply carrying out his mission. Artyom was brought to Korbut, who injected him with a truth serum. Artyom told him everything he knew about the blacks. While unconscious, he overheard fragments of plans. Pavel was to hand over the suitcase containing the virus to smugglers in Venice, who would deliver it to Oktyabrskaya station, where people were to be infected as a test. The black cub was to be retrieved from the Hanseatic circus and delivered to the Red Line. Korbut wanted to use its telepathic abilities as a weapon. When Korbut left, Artyom was freed by an unexpected ally, Leonid Moskvin, the general secretary's son. A young man fed up with cruelty, fed up with lies, fed up with his father's beatings, and fed up with the system he'd grown up in. Upon his release, Artyom immediately set out in pursuit of Pavel. He made his way through Revolution Square, witnessing along the way the communists completing the construction of an armored train, an entire armored convoy for the assault on D6. He met Andrei Kuznets, an old acquaintance who had by then settled into a service position after the Reds took Kuznetsky most. Kuznets gave him his automatic handcar, the Regina. Artyom rode the Regina to Venice, but had to abandon it in the flooded tunnels. A fisherman named Fyodor ferried him by boat to Tretyakovskaya. There, Artyom found Pavel and threatened him into revealing where to look for the Black Cub. He then surfaced and headed for the Sparta outpost in the Cathedral of Christ the Savior. He was too late. A Red detachment led by Lesnitsky had already arrived. They killed all the rangers, took Anna hostage, and crushed Artyom against the door. He was saved by the fact that the bullet that should have killed him hit Hunter's dog tag, the very same dog tag the old lookout had given him before disappearing into the darkness. Lesnitsky led the men to Oktyabrskaya, and Artyom followed him through the old catacombs. But the communists got there first. By the time he reached Oktyabrskaya, the detachment had already captured the Black Pup. The virus had already been dispersed, and the station was contaminated. To prevent an epidemic, the Reds began burning all the inhabitants alive, methodically, without hesitation. Lesnitsky managed to escape again. Artyom dragged Anya to the Oktyabrskaya Koltsevaya station, where a doctor examined them and found no signs of infection. Anya, wounded, was left in the hospital. Meanwhile, a peace conference was being prepared at police. The Order, the Hansa, the Red Line, and the Reich were all gathered around the same table. The Reds planned to use this as cover. While Melnik was in session, the armored train would strike D6. Khan realized there was no peaceful solution here. There was only one way out: the Black Cub. This mutant possessed abilities that could change everything, but the Red train had already left. Khan led Artyom into a tunnel where a mystical river flowed across the floor. According to him, it could supernaturally transport them to a specific point in space and time. Khan asked him to think of black as he entered the water. They entered. They shared a vision, the very moment when Artyom destroyed the hive. And they emerged from the water at the crossing near Park Kulturi, right next to the Reds' train route. They found a handcar and caught up with the convoy. Artyom jumped onto the train. He found the cub, and he showed him, through telepathic communication, how the blacks actually came to people. Not to threaten, to help. They simply didn't know any other way. Ullman, unaware of any of this, blew up the train at that moment. Artyom and the cubs survived. Artyom pulled the black one to the surface and let him go. He simply let him go, because he repented of the deaths of his fellow creatures and couldn't bring himself to use a living creature as a tool, even for the sake of peace. The cubs sensed the sincerity and decided to stay by his side voluntarily. Together, they set off for police. Along the way, they were ambushed by Lesnitsky at a depot near Red Square. The battle, Lesnitsky's capture, and the reading of his memories through the Black One. These are the details of the plan to strike D6. And Artyom let Lesnitsky go, alive. Not because he was weak, but because he decided so. They walked across Red Square together, Artyom and the Black One. A mystical anomaly swirled in the dark space of the square. The souls of the dead, trying to capture Artyom. Black helped him through. At the Voskresensky gate, they were ambushed by the Reds again, this time led by that same Pavel Morozov. They figured it out. Artyom saw Morozov's memories. Korbut was planning to strike D6 right during the negotiations. And then the Black One did something Artyom didn't expect. When the anomaly grabbed Pavel, the same Pavel who had betrayed Artyom tranquilized him and handed him over to Korbut. Artyom rushed in and pulled him out. He saved the traitor. The Black One saw it, and he understood what forgiveness meant. They met with Melnik and Khan at the descent to police and went together to negotiate. The task was both simple and impossible. Convince Moskvin to make peace. It was impossible on their own. They weren't strong enough to repel the Reds' attack. police proposed a fair division of the D6 among all factions. The Reich agreed and called off the attack. When General Secretary Maxim Moskvin spoke, the Black One, disguised as a small child, approached him and touched him. And Moskvin spoke. He confessed to everyone that he'd killed his brother. He told everyone about Korbut's plans. Everything, no secrets. Melnik and Artyom immediately rushed to D6 to prepare for defense. Black went deeper into the bunker, and there, in one of the closed rooms, he found something he'd likely known about for a long time. Other Blacks. Those Artyom had thought dead. Not all, but some. They'd been sleeping here since the very beginning, since the D6 was still under construction. Black decided to wake them up and ask for help. Meanwhile, the Sparta Rangers were making their final stand. The Reds were pressing from all sides, and holding their positions was becoming increasingly difficult. An armored train rammed the fortifications. Ulman was killed. Many died. Melnik was seriously wounded and was preparing to activate the bunker's self-destruct system to keep it from falling into communist hands. Artyom was already reaching for the button when the Blacks entered the bunker. They stunned the Reds with a single telepathic pulse. The fighting stopped immediately. The remaining Spartans were rescued. The Blacks stood for a moment, looked at the people, and left. They promised to return. Someday, when the people are ready. Khan disappeared immediately after the battle, simply vanished as usual. Miller survived, but lost both his legs in the battle. He returned to Polis in a wheelchair to revive Sparta. Kuznets made him prosthetics that restored his ability to walk. The Moscow Defense Command, the Invisible Observers, were impressed. They recruited rangers to guard the city's borders and briefed Melnik on the details of Plan Shield. Now he knew there was life outside, that the world hadn't ended. Artyom left Sparta. He married Anya and moved with her to VDNKH, but peace wouldn't come to him. Back there on the Ostankino Tower, his radio transmitter picked up a signal that penetrated all the jammers. Artyom couldn't get it out of his head. Time and again he surfaced, trying to pick it up again and again. During one of these forays, Artyom and Anya wandered into the forbidden territory of the Hansa. There, in this strange quiet place where nothing living should have been, they saw a train. A real working train running along the rails. This meant only one thing. There was life beyond Moscow. Hansa knows about this and carefully conceals it. A Hansa patrol detained them immediately. Two others were also taken into custody. An elderly woman and a young man who had walked to Moscow searching for a relative. All four were taken to Sherbinka, where the radio center was located. There, the soldiers were planning to execute the detainees, not because they were dangerous, but because it was easier. Witnesses who knew too much were a problem. The best solution was to get rid of the problem. Artyom tried to stop the execution. He was hit by a bullet that should have killed him outright, but it hit Hunter's dog tag. He fell into a pit for corpses. He got out. He went to look for Anya. Inside the radio center, he was helped by a train driver named Yermak, a soldier tired of watching executions. They happen, even in the harshest systems. Yermak helped turn the train platform around so they had an escape route. Artyom found Anya and freed her, but during a fight with the guards, he accidentally damaged the control panel. The jammers failed. Communication with the outside world became possible. They had already left by train when they were intercepted by Sparta Rangers. Melnik sat in the command car with a very sour expression on his face. Damaging the jammers is sabotage. Hijacking a train is too. Under metro law, execution without trial is a crime. But the Rangers didn't kill Artyom and Anya. They refused. Hansa had already sent an armored train after them. Melnik made an instant decision. He feigned surrender, slowed down, and while the enemy relaxed, Artyom boarded their train and planted the explosives. After the explosion, they had no choice. They couldn't return to Moscow. They kill for that kind of thing there. And so a decision was made that changed everything. If there was life beyond Moscow, then it had to be found. Melnik had heard about the underground bunker Ark in the southern Urals, where the country's leadership was supposedly hiding. He wanted to get there, tell the truth about Moscow, and ask for help in reviving Russia. The train was named Aurora, in honor of the cruiser whose shot had once changed the country's history. And so, they headed east. They reached the Saratov region without any particular adventures. But at the bridge over the Volga, the Aurora came under fire. The culprits turned out to be the Elektrobortsi, a sect that believed that technology and electricity had destroyed humanity. As a sign of their renunciation, they completely rejected electricity and reverted to something resembling a primitive society. Fires, bows, no engines. They controlled the river crossing and had no intention of allowing anyone with machinery to cross. During emergency braking, one of the Aurora's engine cylinders blew out. They stopped. Artyom went to investigate and, in the local temple of the electric fighters, came across a nurse named Katya, who, along with her young daughter Nastya, was being held captive by the cult leader Silanti. Katya gave a name. Mechanic Crest lives in the port. He can fix the engine. Anya took Katya and Nastya to the Aurora. Artyom went to see Crest. He turned out to be a simple and practical man. He was just about to head east, so he accepted the offer to help fix the train in exchange for a place on the crew without much thought. But then it turned out that Anya was missing. She'd gone on a reconnaissance mission and never returned. They found her in an underground room filled with an unknown gas. The gas had consequences. It damages the lungs, but slowly, imperceptibly. At first, everything seems fine. Then the coughing started. Then it got worse. Melnik came up with a plan for the crossing. Wait for a merchant barge, board it disguised as traders, and drive through the electric fighter's base. While Crest distracted the guards, Artyom and Ranger Niaz climbed onto the bridge and lowered it. They met Silanti face to face. He, unexpectedly, decided not to fight. He let the Aurora pass. Apparently, there was something human in him after all. They reached Yamanta without significant losses. And there they discovered something worse than any mutant. There was no government in the Ark bunker. Cannibals lived there. The bunker wasn't completed before the war broke out, and the builders were trapped underground without supplies and did the only thing they could to survive. Then they fixed the satellite dish and sent out a signal. They said they could come here. There was a shelter. They lured people in. The meeting with the cannibal leadership ended predictably. Capture. But American Ranger Sam and a soldier nicknamed Idiot opened fire on the cannibals before they could do anything. They escaped, captured the command center, and found the Ark archives with the coordinates of several communications centers. The new plan: reach the Caspi-1 Space Communications Center, obtain radiation images of the country from satellites, and find a habitable place. It was there, in a normal place, that something real could begin. They barely made it to the Caspian Sea. They ran out of coal for the furnace. They looked around. The area was controlled by a certain baron, a dictator who had seized control of the oil rigs and enslaved the entire population for dozens of kilometers around. Negotiating with such a man would be a waste of time. People like that understand only two languages: force and profit. But first, reconnaissance was needed. A girl named Gul contacted the Aurora via radio. She was holding the local lighthouse alone and asked for help. Artyom reached her and killed the Baron's men. In gratitude, Gul helped them break into an abandoned communications center, where they found a satellite map for 2019. Then, Artyom and Ranger Damir quietly stole a truck carrying a tank of fresh water from the Baron's men. The Aurora's crew had been suffering from thirst for some time. They then broke into the Baron's fortress to retrieve the oil tank. The Baron revealed the plan and proposed negotiations, which of course involved an ambush, but with the wrong people. Gul killed the Baron, the Spartans dealt with the guards. The Aurora moved on. The next stop was a river valley with a hydroelectric power station, an ideal location for a colony. Water, power, and a protected location. But by then, Anya's health had deteriorated sharply. She began coughing up blood. that same gas from the Volga dungeon had finally made its presence felt. Katya, now part of the team, remembered that the drug Renergan F had been produced in Novosibirsk. After the war, it was used to treat gas poisoning. If it still existed anywhere, it was there. Melnik decided to first settle in the river valley, then travel to Novosibirsk to get the medicine. The valley, however, gave them a hostile reception. The area was shared between two groups of semi-wild people, who were also plagued by the raids of a huge mutated bear, the master of the forest. The dam near the hydroelectric power station was barely holding up and could burst at any moment, releasing a radioactive reservoir. It was a poor place to live. Anna's condition worsened with each passing day. They turned around and headed for Novosibirsk. By that time, the Novosibirsk metro was almost deserted. The history of this city is a tragedy in itself, quiet and terrifying. The Novosibirsk metro once also became a refuge for thousands of people. But the subway there is shallow, radiation shielding is insufficient, and the aftermath of a dirty bomb used early in the war made the city's radiation levels 8 times higher than Moscow's. All these years, people were saved by a powerful radiation protectant called Zelyonka. While it lasted, they held out. But by 2034, the reserves began to run low. Metro Command, the Special Committee, ASCOM, began preparing for evacuation and sent out stalkers to search for radiation maps across the country to find a way to escape. But in 2035, the command realized there wouldn't be enough radiation protector to evacuate the entire population. So they made a decision that can only be described as betrayal, to leave themselves without the people. They began confiscating the greenery from residents, taking away from people what kept them alive, for the sake of those who considered themselves more important. This sparked a rebellion. Inevitable, violent. Fighting began. Most of the metro's population perished in this internal war. The rebels managed to pin ASCOM to the Sibirskaya station. While the fighting raged, the top leadership quietly evacuated. And the rest, both rebels and their own fighters, were gassed. Everyone. Lieutenant Colonel Vyacheslav Klebnikov managed to escape. He emerged and saw Lieutenant General Vinogradov, the head of ASCOM, killing the last surviving soldier. The last witness. Then Vinogradov looked around. He saw that the entire command had left without him, that his son had been killed in battle, and he shot himself. Only 2 people remained in the Novosibirsk metro, Klebnikov and his son, Kirill. Klebnikov decided to leave on his own. He went to the Satellite Communications Center to get a radiation map, the very one they had been searching for so long. I found the map, but on the way back, I encountered a mutated gorilla, a mole rat. In the fight, I broke the last ampule of green stuff and died from radiation exposure. When the Aurora reached Novosibirsk, the Rangers discovered high radiation levels. Survival on the surface was untenable, but in the metro, the radiation levels were sufficient to allow movement. Artyom and Melnik descended underground and encountered Kirill, young, confused, and completely alone. He told them about his father, gave them 2 vials of green paint, and radioed Melnik to the communications center, where he was to find Klebnikov's body and the map. Artyom went to the Research Institute of Experimental Medicine to get Renergan F. He found it, but on the way back, he clashed with a mole rat, the same gorilla, only a different one. They fought until they both fell out of the institute's window. The mole rat fell onto the rebar and died. Artyom was seriously injured, received a large dose of radiation, and lost consciousness. Meanwhile, Melnik reached the communications center, found Klebnikov's body, retrieved the map, and returned to the metro. He and Kirill went to the institute and found Artyom. Melnik injected him with his last dose of radioprotectant, the last one left, to keep the boy alive until the Aurora. On the way, it became clear that Melnik wouldn't last long without the green stuff. He died from radiation exposure. Quiet, like a man who had made difficult decisions his entire life and was able to take responsibility for them to the end. Artyom and Kirill reached the Aurora. The Rangers gave Artyom a blood transfusion, brought him back from the brink of death. Anna was cured with Renergan. Klebnikov's map showed where there was a clearing, Lake Baikal. That's where they settled. A new house was built there. Artyom was chosen as the new head of the Sparta Order. He accepted, even though at the very beginning of this story, he was just a guy from VDNKH who wanted to get to police and tell everyone about the mutants. Ranger Sam didn't stay. All this time, he thought about San Diego, his hometown, which might still exist. He said goodbye to his comrades and headed east, to Vladivostok, from where he could reach America by ship. After 6 months of travel, he reached the sunken city. There, he found Captain Eduard Baranov and his nuclear submarine moored offshore. Theoretically, it could have reached the States, but they needed fuel. They were attacked by a flock of mantowings, mutants with enormous wings, and Sam found himself separated from the captain. After a fight with the creatures, he came across bandits who brought him to the leader, a man named Tom, a former American businessman who found himself in Russia at an unfortunate time and adapted to the new rules of life. Tom also wanted to get to America. He offered a deal. Sam would convince Baranov to reveal the location of the fuel, and Tom would help him escape. Sam found the captain in a high-rise building and helped him fight off the Beastmen, local mutants. Baranov spoke with Tom on the radio and agreed to the following terms: fuel in exchange for a promise not to use the submarine's nuclear missiles and to deal with Tom's right-hand man, Klim, who was involved with freelance gangsters. The fuel was stored in a submarine bunker with high radiation levels. They found a chemical shield, extracted the fuel, and the submarine received its fuel. The way west, or east, depending on how you look at it, was open. Sam was returning home. What he found there is another story, and the Moscow metro continued to function. The blacks left, but promised to return. Sparta's rangers guarded the borders. The Hansa traded. The Red Line was being rebuilt after Korbutz's failure. The Fourth Reich was still there. Houses were being built on Lake Baikal. The world that had destroyed itself on July 6, 2013 was slowly, centimeter by centimeter, coming back to life. It wasn't the same world it had been before. Different, smaller, scarier, more complex, but alive. And that, perhaps, is the most important thing in the history of the Metro universe. Not the catastrophe that opened it, but the fact that people didn't stop being human after it. Not all of them, and not always, but enough to continue.